It was just another typical morning in Santa Clara, California. Commuters navigated the familiar traffic along the freeways. Tech workers swiped into their buildings, and the hum of the Silicon Valley office campuses filled the air with the usual rhythm of corporate life. Employees greeted each other in coffee lines, janitorial staff made their rounds, and conference rooms buzzed with early meetings. Nothing felt wrong, everything seemed perfectly normal. But then, without warning, the landscape began to change. Reports surfaced showing that over 37% of office spaces in the Bay Area were now vacant. Entire floors sat untouched. Buildings that had housed thriving startups and established tech giants for decades now stood empty, totaling more than 29 million square feet of unused space. Employees who once expected stability in these headquarters now faced an uncertain future. What happened to the bustling offices that were once the pride of Silicon Valley? How could a region synonymous with innovation suddenly feel so abandoned? And perhaps the most pressing question, if remote work can render these massive office parks obsolete, what does the future hold for the traditional corporate headquarters in America? For decades, the Santa Clara office campuses were more than just buildings. They were a symbol of Silicon Valley's dominance in the tech world. Spanning tens of millions of square feet, these campuses housed hundreds of companies, from fledgling startups to multinational tech giants. The scale was staggering: sprawling office complexes, landscaped courtyards, and conference centers that could accommodate thousands at a time. Inside, thousands of employees worked side by side, fueling innovation that shaped the entire country's technology landscape. The number of workers on these campuses reached into the tens of thousands, all contributing to a network that connected every corner of the tech ecosystem. Local economies thrived around these hubs. Coffee shops, restaurants, gyms, and service providers depended on the steady foot traffic from office employees. For the past 30-plus years, the region was considered untouchable. Investors poured millions into expansions and upgrades, reinforcing the belief that these campuses would remain the backbone of the Bay Area's economy indefinitely. The influence of this area reached far beyond Santa Clara, touching other parts of California and even affecting supply chains, software development, and tech services across the country. It was hard to imagine these headquarters could ever become obsolete. The combination of years of growth, large-scale operations, and a robust local economy created a sense of permanence. For many, the idea of empty offices in the heart of Silicon Valley seemed almost impossible, like a city losing its heartbeat overnight. Yet, the very factors that once made these campuses a symbol of power, massive size, centralized operations, and long-term leases now made them vulnerable to the shift toward remote work. What was once considered unshakable was suddenly at risk, leaving a community and industry wondering if the pillars they relied on could disappear faster than anyone imagined. The city of Santa Clara had grown in tandem with its office parks. Entire neighborhoods were built to accommodate the employees of Silicon Valley office campuses, with families settling down in the area for long-term stability. Local schools flourished, funded in part by property taxes from the thriving corporate ecosystem. Parents could count on their children receiving quality education, and communities felt a sense of security that lasted for decades. Beyond education, small businesses thrived because of the constant influx of office workers. Cafes, restaurants, gyms, and convenience stores depended heavily on the daily presence of thousands of employees. Service providers, from dry cleaners to local transit, had their schedules dictated by the rhythm of office life. The stability of these businesses and the livelihood of their owners were intertwined with the occupancy of these campuses. For many residents, life revolved around the predictable cycle of the office park. Commuters knew the morning and evening traffic patterns. Families planned around work schedules, and community events were often scheduled to coincide with the corporate calendar. The presence of the local workforce gave the city its identity, and the sense of belonging fostered deep-rooted connections. Even the real estate market had adjusted to this ecosystem. Homeowners counted on long-term employment guarantees to secure mortgages and plan for the future. Rental properties were in high demand, and the flow of corporate employees ensured that neighborhoods remained vibrant. The city itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with the daily operations of the office campuses. But as empty floors began to appear and businesses noticed fewer customers, the once steady employment and community stability started to show cracks. Families who had counted on decades of predictable routine began to feel uncertainty creeping in. The invisible threads that tied Santa Clara together, work, school, and local commerce, were suddenly fraying, hinting at the broader human cost of the shifting workplace. When the first signs of vacancy appeared across the Santa Clara office campuses, the impact on families was immediate. Take, for example, a longtime employee approaching retirement. After 25 years of work, he had planned his life around the predictability of his job. His mortgage, healthcare coverage, and retirement plans all depended on a steady paycheck from a company he had trusted for decades. Suddenly, uncertainty replaced certainty, and even a lifetime of experience offered no shield against the looming instability. Young families were equally affected. Parents relied on the stability provided by these office parks to fund schooling for their children, daycare programs, and extracurricular activities. The predictability of daily routines, work schedules, and benefits had been woven into every aspect of their lives. With the shift toward remote work and mass vacancies, parents now faced tough questions. Could they afford to stay in the city? Should they consider moving elsewhere, or risk losing the support network they had built over years? Employees who had invested decades of their lives into these companies were forced to confront the sudden disappearance of a familiar structure. The mortgage commitments, healthcare plans, and community ties that once felt unbreakable were now fragile. Even those who were mobile or tech-savvy found relocation challenging. The Bay Area's high cost of living and competitive housing market made sudden moves daunting, if not impossible. The human cost extended beyond finances. Confidence in career trajectories, community engagement, and personal routines began to erode. For many, the psychological impact of seeing once bustling offices now silent was profound. The city that had seemed permanent and reliable now felt unpredictable. Families faced sleepless nights and anxious days, trying to plan for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. While the headlines focused on millions of square feet left empty, the real story was about the individuals whose lives had been intertwined with these buildings for decades. The predictable cadence of work, school, and community involvement had been disrupted. Families, workers, and even local business owners were all forced to navigate a new reality where nothing could be taken for granted. For years, the Santa Clara office campuses appeared unshakable. Investors poured millions of dollars into renovations and expansions, and companies publicly reaffirmed their long-term commitments to the region. New amenities, upgraded workspaces, and tech-focused infrastructure gave employees confidence that these headquarters would remain the heart of Silicon Valley for decades to come. Employees and local officials alike were caught off guard. There were no warnings, no gradual shifts that could have signaled the looming vacancy crisis. The sense of trust built over decades was abruptly disrupted. Buildings that had seen constant activity now stood quiet, the sound of tapping keyboards and office chatter replaced by silence. The community felt a betrayal, not in a personal sense, but in the reliability they had long assumed. Years of investment, both financial and emotional, seemed to vanish overnight. Companies that had promised continuity and stability suddenly embraced remote work models, leaving vast spaces empty and questioning the very concept of the traditional corporate office. The stark contrast between the millions of dollars invested, the years of employee dedication, and the sudden abandonment highlighted the fragile nature of assumed permanence. What once seemed a secure anchor for Santa Clara's economy now revealed itself to be vulnerable, subject to forces beyond local control. It was a moment that reshaped perspectives. Residents, workers, and local businesses realized that the apparent security of decades-long commitments could disappear without warning. The betrayal wasn't malicious, it was systemic, but its impact was deeply felt across the community. The decline of the Santa Clara office campuses cannot be traced to a single factor. Instead, multiple forces converged to reshape the landscape of work in Silicon Valley, illustrating a shift that was both structural and inevitable. One of the most immediate pressures came from rising operating costs. Commercial rents, energy, and utilities in the Bay Area surged over the past decade, placing a financial strain on companies that relied on dense, centralized office spaces. Maintaining climate-controlled buildings, advanced networking infrastructure, and expansive amenities became increasingly expensive. Margins were squeezed, as tech companies weighed the cost of empty office floors against the benefits of retaining massive campuses. Logistics and physical infrastructure also played a role. Office campuses designed for in-person collaboration required vast amounts of space, from conference centers to parking structures. As remote work became normalized, these areas were underutilized, creating inefficiencies that traditional office models could not justify. Space that had once supported thousands of employees now sat idle, forcing companies to reconsider their footprint. Labor trends accelerated the change. The Bay Area workforce, traditionally drawn to the appeal of vibrant corporate campuses, adapted quickly to remote work. Employees realized they could maintain productivity from home, reduce commuting costs, and gain flexibility, all while enjoying the same career opportunities. This shift in employee behavior created a feedback loop. Fewer people commuting led to reduced demand for nearby services, further undermining the local ecosystem that had supported office life. Consumer and industry pressures compounded the issue. Businesses observed how quickly the pandemic accelerated changes in workplace norms, prompting them to experiment with hybrid or fully remote models. Competitors outside Silicon Valley, where real estate was more affordable and commuting less burdensome, began attracting talent without the overhead of massive campuses. The pressure across the sector forced executives to question whether sprawling headquarters were still necessary or sustainable. Financial logic, too, dictated a move away from legacy offices. Companies reassessed long-term leases, capital expenditures, and operational margins, often deciding that liquidating or downsizing physical assets would strengthen their balance sheets. The combination of rising costs, logistics inefficiencies, changing consumer and employee behavior, and industry-wide pressures created a perfect storm that rendered the once thriving office parks increasingly obsolete. Yet, no single factor explains the full story. It was the intersection of technology, economics, and culture that reshaped the Bay Area's landscape. Supply chains, workplace behavior, and community reliance all shifted simultaneously, leaving even the most established campuses vulnerable. The reality became clear. Silicon Valley's office parks were no longer immune to structural change, and adaptation, not tradition, dictated survival. The closure and downsizing of the Santa Clara office campuses did not just affect the buildings themselves, it sent ripples across millions of lives and the wider economy. Local businesses that had thrived on the daily presence of thousands of office workers began to feel the impact almost immediately. Cafes and lunch spots reported fewer customers, gyms saw membership drops, and service providers from dry cleaners to transit services experienced declining demand. The everyday life of the community was suddenly altered. Beyond the immediate neighborhood, consumers across the country experienced subtle yet measurable effects. Tech companies adjusting to remote work faced logistical challenges in managing their operations and delivering services. Software development cycles slowed slightly, client meetings moved online, and some projects were delayed due to fewer on-site staff. Even products and services that Americans took for granted were indirectly affected by empty offices and restructured teams. The financial consequences were tangible as well. Corporate budgets once allocated for office maintenance, utilities, and local vendor services were redirected toward remote work infrastructure laptops, cloud storage, virtual collaboration tools. While these investments supported productivity, they also represented a shift in spending away from local economies that had long depended on the presence of on-site employees. Real estate markets also felt the shockwave. Large office buildings sitting vacant contributed to a temporary oversupply, depressing rental rates and making it harder for property owners to secure tenants. The prices of commercial leases in the Bay Area adjusted to the new reality, creating uncertainty for investors and developers. The cumulative effect was a change in how businesses, employees, and communities interacted with the physical spaces of Silicon Valley. Even at the individual level, the effects were felt in subtle ways. Commuters saved hours previously spent in traffic, but they also lost the casual interactions that built professional networks. Neighborhoods lost foot traffic, reducing opportunities for small business owners to connect with customers. The delays and adjustments in daily routines highlighted just how interconnected the ecosystem had been. Ultimately, the story of the Santa Clara office parks serves as a reminder that no economic or social hub exists in isolation. The transformation of these campuses demonstrated how the decisions of a few large organizations could reverberate through everyday life, influencing markets, communities, and the way people work and interact. The decline of the Santa Clara office campuses is far from unique. Across the country, similar patterns have emerged in cities that once thrived on centralized corporate headquarters. In Austin, Texas, office towers built for tech giants now sit partially empty as remote work becomes the norm. In Seattle, Washington, sprawling campuses that were once bustling with employees have seen significant reductions in occupancy, leaving local businesses scrambling to adjust. These examples share a common theme: companies withdrawing quietly, leaving communities to absorb the consequences. The closures are not isolated. They reflect a broader pattern across the country. Office parks, once considered pillars of regional economies, are increasingly vulnerable to changing workforce behaviors and technological shifts. What makes these cases noteworthy is not the vacancy itself, but the consistent model: rapid adoption of remote work, minimal advance warning, and a heavy reliance on historical assumptions about employee presence. Communities, investors, and even municipal services were often unprepared, highlighting that this trend is systemic rather than accidental. The story of Santa Clara serves as a lens to understand a nationwide phenomenon. As companies rethink their physical footprint, cities across the United States are facing similar disruptions. The decline of traditional headquarters is not a one-off event. It is part of a broader transformation shaping the American workplace, the economy, and the communities that depend on them. Today, the Santa Clara office campuses stand as silent monuments to a once thriving era. Empty parking lots stretch for miles, and glass-fronted buildings that once hummed with activity now reflect only the sky above. The absence of workers is palpable, and the community feels the quiet in ways both subtle and profound. Local cafes and service providers operate on reduced hours. Neighborhoods that once pulsed with the rhythms of commuting now experience a slower, quieter pace. Even the smallest interactions, greetings in the lobby, lunchtime chatter, spontaneous collaborations in conference rooms are missing. The predictability that families and employees had relied on for decades has been replaced by uncertainty, leaving a lingering sense of unease. Yet, there is no clear villain, no dramatic catastrophe. The offices did not fail due to neglect or poor management. They were simply overtaken by forces beyond anyone's control: rising costs, evolving workforce expectations, and the inexorable shift toward remote work. The silence speaks volumes, reminding observers that stability, no matter how deeply ingrained, is never guaranteed. As one walks through these empty corridors, it raises a profound question. If something this foundational can disappear almost overnight, what does stability really mean anymore? The story of Santa Clara is a cautionary tale, not of failure, but of transformation. It reflects how communities, economies, and daily life are intertwined with corporate decisions, and how quickly the familiar can become unfamiliar. For now, the office parks remain, standing quietly monuments to the past and a reminder of how fragile perceived permanence can be. The echoes of bustling workspaces linger only in memory, leaving the city and its people to navigate a new reality defined by change, adaptability, and the unknown.